being judgmental. And boy, are we a judgmental culture, aren't we? We are a culture that enjoys looking at other people and putting down their choices, right? And having their statement about their choices. If you recall the days of Jerry Springer, that was the cultural thing, right? It was Jerry Springer's on. You know, we love watching the people in our culture who have just destroyed their lives with their decisions, right? And it got rowdy and it got ugly and for whatever reason, our culture just loved to watch it every week, right? Every day. Then there's, of course, Judge Judy. We love Judge Judy. In fact, they just brought her back for a whole new series, I think, on her. You know, is that, you know, for many years, right? She'd hear out the court case, and we'd love her, just her, you know, no nonsense. I'm gonna take out your case, and I'm gonna tell you what I think, and we just love to watch that, don't we? And of course, that has just led us to a state where there is every reality TV show in the world that comes on, and we just, you know, whether it's real or whether it's fake, and most of it's fake, but we just love to just look at people and the decisions they make and cast the judgment that says, well, they deserve that. God, what's coming to them, right? How could they be so foolish? How could they be so ridiculous? You know, we love to do that in our culture. We love to be able to come at that. And so as we love to do that, we then have to take Jesus' words really carefully in Matthew chapter 7 when he says, judge not that you be not judged. Ooh, judge not that you be not judged. Now, there's two ways that our culture takes this statement, right? Because this is the statement that a lot of people come in and they say, hey, Jesus says, don't judge, man. And it's like, yeah, that's right. Don't judge me. Don't you judge me for the decisions that I made. Don't judge me for all the things that I do. And at the other side of that, there's the idea of just dismissing. Did Jesus really mean don't judge me? Did he really mean don't put judgment out there? And so we come in and we dismiss this verse out of hand by saying, that's not what Jesus meant. He didn't mean don't judge. And yet the reality is that both of those are wrong. Both of those perceptions of this verse are wrong. To either say, yeah, don't judge me, don't look at my sins and my wrong choices and the things that I do and say anything about what I do, or to say, well, Jesus didn't really mean don't judge. We should just judge all we want because, you know, we have to have appropriate judgment, but Jesus didn't really mean don't judge. The reality is, Jesus says, don't judge, lest you be judged. He said that. We have to deal with the fact that Jesus said that statement. Don't judge, lest you be judged. Now, there is more to that statement. That's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, there is more to what he's about to say to that, but we can't gloss over the fact that Jesus makes a commandment here. He makes a proclamation. Don't judge. Don't rely on your judgment of other people. Don't put that out there. That's an important point that we need to wrap our minds around and what he's really trying to drive at when he says that. So when he says that, right, does he mean that I'm supposed to leave people's sins out? I'm not supposed to tell people when their sins are. I really shouldn't, come at people and tell them when they're doing something wrong? I don't think that's what he's saying. Because if we look over at 2 Timothy chapter 2 for just a minute, 2 Timothy chapter 2, we are called as the church to reprove each other. If you'll turn with me just a second as I find it. In chapter 4, verse 2, he says, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. And so there's this notion that, yeah, we're supposed to be calling each other out. We're supposed to be lifting each other out. We're supposed to say, hey, you're doing something wrong. You're doing something that's not right to the word. You're supposed to be coming at each other with the notion that, hey, you need to correct some behavior. That's important. That's necessary. We're commanded to do that. So you can't take Jesus' statement of judge not lest you be judged and say, all right, well, that's your problem and I'm just going to stay out of it. Right? I'm going to stay out of it and leave you to make your own decisions and your own fault. If I leave you to that, I've done something unchristian towards you. All right? It requires some judgment calls. But then let's also talk about gossip for just a second. Because I think that's really where the heart of this judgment problem is in gossip. It's in the idea that I'm going to, in the back room or behind your back or with the other people, we're all going to get together and we're going to talk about the things that you've been doing. Oh, how could they do that? Oh, what a terrible thing. I can't believe he went and did that. Oh, she got what she deserved, right? That's the nature of that conversation. It's judgment in its form, right? It's just judgment of other people, and we don't even have the dignity to say it to their face, right? To just put it out there and say, "Hey, I've got a judgment for you, and that was a pretty terrible thing," and say it right to you. It's this hushed thing in the background, and that we're just doing it behind your back. It serves no purpose other than to hoist this idea of judgment out in a way that is wrong, in a way that is inappropriate, that is, again, I would call sinful and against what Jesus is trying to call out here. And with gossip, again, it's rife in our culture, isn't it? Water cooler talk. You go out and, in the office and everyone's talking about the boss, and, you go into your community, everyone's talking about that neighbor who did that thing. We often talk about the other person behind their back. We don't even think about it even. It's just so rife in our culture that it just seems like that's normal, natural. That's the way we engage in our communities is gossip. And if you think about it, even with the whole social media thing, just because it's on the internet and plastered everywhere for everyone to see, doesn't make it okay for us to talk about it, because that's still gossip, right? That's still the idea of putting judgment out there in a way that damages, that hurts, it's harmful. We have to be careful and think about this acts of judgment. So there's a reason why we're not supposed to judge. There's a reason why. Paul tells us in 1 Timothy 5:13, he calls out the practice by saying, besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So this is not the kind of conversation that we should be having. It's not the way we should engage and talk. It hurts and damages the church, as Paul puts it. But Jesus gives us more information on that when he calls out why we shouldn't judge. So he says that statement. Jesus continues on in this concept of judgment, and he says in verse 2, "For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." All right, so the judgment that we pronounce, the measure we use, that's going to be what's against me. Okay, so if I am judging someone on decisions and choices that they make, I better be really, really sure that I am not doing the exact same thing, right? I better be sure that I, who am gossiping about someone who steals money, I better be sure that I have all the integrity in the world on my money, right? I should be sure that if I'm judging someone in their relationships, that I have all the integrity in the world on my relationships. I can't do anything that I judge someone else for. And let's be honest, right? When we throw that judgment out there, we're completely innocent of all the things that we judge people on, aren't we? We can never say, we never do the things that we call people out in reality TV, right? None of us have ever done anything so ridiculous and silly as these people that we see on television or on Facebook and those kinds. None of us. No, I don't think Jesus believes that, because he then continues to say, he says in verse 3, "Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye and do not notice the log that is in your brother's? Let them take the speck out of your eye, then or how can you say to your brother," verse 4, "let me take the speck out of your eye while there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." And Jesus says this right here in this way, because when we judge people, when we cast out this nature of judgment, we are very hypocritical in our judgments. That's a pretty natural thing. We tend to judge the thing we're guilty of more harshly, in fact. So you should be thinking about, we should be considering, hey, when I'm pretty harsh in judgment, how is that really hitting me, right? If I point a finger, what are my three fingers pointing back at me, right? That's the age-old saying. And the question is, so what is it that you are guilty of when we're harsh in judgment on people? We should be careful about that. And the reality is when Jesus says, be careful of your judgment because the judgment you put, the measure that you use will be measured against you. If that doesn't scare you, read it again. If that doesn't terrify you about the idea that you're going to go before God and He's going to measure with the measuring rod you've used in life, that doesn't scare you, read that again. Honestly, if I look back in the way that I have judged, the way that I have used a measuring rod against people, I'm a little nervous. Thank the Lord for Jesus, okay? Thank the Lord that I have grace, because if it wasn't, I'm going to have a lot of trouble with this, right? I need to be careful of this just as much as you have, because we are very hypocritical in nature when it comes to our judgments. And I think that's straight from what Jesus is talking about here, because that's typically how we judge on things, is the things that we're more guilty of. The things that we're guilty of are the things we are harshest on. And so we need to be careful about anything, though, that we put judgment on. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why when Jesus tells us to deal with things and deal in judgment, that we need to be careful. We need to be careful because of how it hurts and harms and does. And so Jesus tells us something in John that's really important, because as much as we got to be careful about this, that doesn't mean that we go through life without judgment calls, right? We got to make judgment calls on things, right? We got to act, we've got to do things, we've got to make decisions. That requires judgment. And if we're not going to use our judgment, if we're going to say, if I don't judge anyone, then there's no measure against me, right? Just back out and then I'm good, I'm safe. No, life is full of judgments. We've got to make judgment calls. And this is what Jesus says in chapter 7 of John, verse 14. I'm sorry, verse 14. It says, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. Then the Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? And Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but His who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of Him who sent him is true. In Him is there no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? And the crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? And Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marveled at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because of the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. Now, we're quick to say on this, we're quick to come to this verse in the defense of Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, that says, we got to judge in right judgment. Jesus is making a call here, though, because He's saying, this is about my works. All right, He's saying, this is about the works that I do, judge with right judgment. And He's calling out their judgment that says that Jesus isn't who He says He is, isn't the person He says. And Jesus is saying, no. You need to look at this. You need to look at this with the right perception of who I am. And when you call me out for something as trivial as making a whole man's body well on the Sabbath, you are calling me out for something ridiculous. And your judgment is askew. It's off. It's wrong. And you need to be paying attention to that. And so there is something to be said about our judgment call when it comes to our relationship with God. When it comes to how I'm going to approach Him, how I'm going to view Him, I need to have right judgment. I need to make a good judgment call in terms of how I'm going to accept and do the will of the Father. And that needs to come on the basis of right judgment, which comes from His Word, right? He's pronouncing that this is coming from God, the one who speaks to me, right? He has no falsehood. It's the idea that if we look and perceive Jesus, if we can hear His words, if we can accept, and we need to have the judgment on where His words are coming from, because they're not coming from Jesus. Jesus doesn't speak on His own authority. We need to have that judgment right and perceive that correctly. If we flip over just another chapter in John, chapter 8, He says this. in verse 15 through 16. He says, "You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true. For it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me." So Jesus here says, right, I don't judge, but if I do judge, I'm judging by the standard that God gives me. Essentially, that's what he's saying. Saying my judgment is not my own judgment. And this, I think, is the key to putting this whole thing in its place. If I am to make judgment calls in life, because I have to make judgment calls in life, I have to make judgment calls about how I approach God. I have to make judgment calls about how I approach you, about how our relationships go forward. I have to make judgment calls about those outside of the church and all the things in the world. I have to make judgments. But those judgments need something else besides my human judgment, because human judgment is errored. It has faults. It's flawed. I don't judge correctly if I'm relying solely on the judgments of Justin. If I rely solely on my judgments, I'm going to be hypocritical. I'm going to be too harsh. I'm going to be unfair. I am not going to be just if I rely solely on me. But if I'm relying on God, as Jesus is relying on the Father, and say, I'm going to make judgments based on what I have been given in the Father, then my judgments are not mine. They're God's judgments. They're His. I can safely hold to the fact that those judgments aren't coming from me, a hypocritical, unjust, unfair, merciless human being. They're coming from the Father who gives graciously, the Father who judges justly and rightly. I am judging based on what He has given me, and there's a lot of I can take that responsibility off my shoulders. It's kind of nice, isn't it? It's kind of nice to know that, hey, that measure that I held up against you, that's the measure that the Father gave me. And that measure that's going to be weighed against me, you know what? While it's going to be weighed against me, I have Jesus. I have Jesus, and He's going to take care of me, and I have His grace, and I know that I'm going to be okay. That should draw a lot of comfort on us. That should draw a lot of comfort, and at the same time, that should really give us a place to go when we talk about this notion of putting out that judgment. It says, man, I need to find safety in the judgment that God gives. If we look closely at another verse, at Isaiah chapter 11, verse 3 through 5, just very quickly, it says, this is about the reign of Jesus, essentially. And it says, "And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins." We should take a lot of comfort in the judgment that God has. In the judgment under Christ, there should be a lot of comfort that it's going to be correct. It's going to be right. It's going to be fair. And not only is it going to be fair, again, we have Jesus to have that grace. So then finally, we come to this last part of chapter 7 on judgment. When we get to this section on judgment, Jesus finally ends this with, "Don't give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you." I think this is a very interesting ending to this section, right? Because this section really is about being careful about your judgment. Be very careful about the way in which you measure against people and the way you treat other people in that. And then he says, yeah, don't give what's precious to pigs. And let's be honest, that's a judgment call, right? I have to be able to say, well, you're a pig and you're not worth my time, right? That's essentially what it's saying. You're a dog and you're not worthy of what is holy. Essentially, that's what Jesus is saying. He says, don't judge, and then, hey, make a judge call about the nature of these people you're dealing with. That's essentially how he's saying that. And it seems contradictory on its face, right? To say, well, Jesus, how am I'm not supposed to judge people. How can I call someone a pig? That seems pretty judgmental, right? They're going to throw that back in my face. Well, the idea here, right, is that there is a reality that there is judgment calls we have to make in life. There's judgment calls on how we need to treat people. There's judgment calls we need to make And if we are holding on to a standard that's not my standard, then I can make these kinds of judgment calls. I have the ability to look at people and say, hey, you know what? It's not worth my time. Hey, you know what? I know what you're going to do with this, and it's just not worth the effort. You know what? I know that if I give this to you, you're just going to hurt me with it, and it's just not worth it. And I can make that judgment call safely. I can make that judgment call and walk away. I can make that judgment call and I can get out of Dodge and not get trampled, not get torn apart, not get persecuted in situations where it demands it. And I think that's the idea of we then have to, once we get this idea of judgment correctly, once I can get the idea that, man, I am not holding on to my own standard of judging. I'm getting the standard of God. I'm looking to God's judgment on things. I'm trying to see things in God's perspective. And then once I put that to work, man, it works really well for me. It works really well. And putting that to work really is an important factor. Because when we put this judgment to use and to function, right, then we know that we can look and say, I know this person is not going to accept what I have to say, right? If I'm going out to spread the gospel and I'm going out to tell other people the good news, and I'm gonna put myself out on the line to share with people my faith, then I can put that judgment to work to say, you know what, that's the kind of person that I don't know that I want to sit down and share with. That's the kind of person that I don't think they're going to take the message very well. And if it's my judgment, there's a lot of people I wouldn't talk to. There's a lot of people I wouldn't give them the time of day. And Jesus says, don't do that, because you're basing that on Justin's standard. You're basing that on a merciless, unjust, cruel, mean perception, right? But I want you to look at it from my perspective. There are people that do not want to hear the gospel. They want to mock God. They don't want to hear what's true. They don't want to listen. Those are the people that I don't know that I should waste my time with those people. When we talk about situations where engaging is only going to make it worse, right? There's just some people that made their mind up about God, and all they're going to do is use that as a way to maybe gain advantage, maybe make you look foolish, maybe, or they're just going to continue to mock. They're just going to have more. It's just going to give them more ammo for their cynical, anti-God ways. Those are the kind of people that we can have some judgment call to say, you know what, that's not the person I really want to engage with. And that's not because they're the bum on the street. It's because when they give me of their spirit, when they tell me where they are, when they tell me what they're about, I have the judgment to be able to believe them. I have the judgment and the fortitude to be able to put that to work to say, you know what? I know when to walk away. I know when not to be a part of this. My favorite example of this in Scripture it is my absolute favorite story of Paul's. If you look at Acts chapter 23, look at Acts chapter 23. Paul is using, he is in, just to give you some backup here, some backstory, Paul is on trial for his life. He is on trial for his life, and he is essentially in the council, and he's trying to persuade the gospel, and he's before people in whom they're not going to believe him. Okay, this is the people who are pretty well committed to killing Paul. They are just finding that one thing that they can pick him up and take him over to the Romans and say, kill him, he said this. Okay, that is the position that Paul is in. Paul has to make judgment calls on how he's going to treat and handle this situation. Okay, he can't just say, well, I'm not judging you and just don't judge me. No, he is being judged, and he's going to make some judgment calls about how to handle the situation. And he says in verse 6 through 9 of chapter 23, he says this. Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees saw that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but all the Pharisees acknowledged them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, we find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or angel spoke to him? Do you see what he did there? Do you see what Paul did there? He took a situation where everyone in the room is against him. Everyone in the room is ready to take whatever he says and use as an excuse to kill him. And he says, I see half the crowd believes one thing, and half the crowd believes another thing, and they are against each other here. And I'm just going to say the one thing that it takes to get them to start fighting and not focus on me. I'm going to get them to start fighting with each other, and they're ready to let me go because they some of them don't believe what I said, and others do. And so that's a judgment call that Paul puts to work for his own benefit. For his own benefit to further the gospel message, right? Not just to save his own skin, but now he gets them to consider and think, well, what if Paul did say something? What if Paul did receive something that he should have seen? So it's a judgment call that again allowed for him to get out of a hot situation and at the same time get some of them to think and maybe even accept the gospel through it. This is the notion of putting our judgment to work. We need to have some perception. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to be a Paul and I'm going to be in a situation. I'm not that clever. Okay, Paul's a pretty clever guy when it comes to this sort of thing. I don't know that I'm going to be able to really, have a moment like that, or any of us are really going to have a moment like that. I certainly hope not. But the idea that, we can use our judgment to work, to advance the gospel, to get people to kind of, just kind of work and maneuver with people. There's a way to do that when we have God's judgment on our side. Again, when I am working and focusing and using God's words and His truth and the things that He gives me in the Word, when I have that on my side and I'm using that for my judgments and I'm using that to come to my conclusions, that is a very powerful thing. Paul puts that in practice here. It's a very powerful thing in the way in which we approach people. And when we take this idea and this notion that, I'm not going to take this standard of I'm going to judge the things that are trivial in this world, right? I'm going to judge the things on my own human ideas and understandings, and on my own unjust system of judgment. When I say I'm going to put that aside, and I'm not going to waste my time with that, I'm not going to worry about that. I want some clarity. I want the clarity of judgment from God. I want the clarity of what His Word tells me and how things are supposed to function because of how He said it. If I put that to work, it's a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing, and again, it takes all of the responsibility off your shoulders. All right, we tend to judge in the trivial and the things up here, and we don't go very deep with our judgments. We judge in the trivial, and again, the responsibility of that is crushing even up here, especially when we realize and understand that that's going to be put against us. But take that off and say, I'm just going to judge things based on how God says it's supposed to be. I'm going to judge things. I said, hey, that this isn't how God said it should be, and this is how God says it should be. If I'm going to make that judgment and that perception, I think there is a powerful end to that. A powerful end to that because it allows God to work in the things in our lives. It allows God to work in people and allows God to work in our relationships. And it is not a damaging force. It is a force that does reprove and rebuke and exhort us to where we should be. And that's our call, is to exhort others, exhort ourselves, exhort to the standard that God gives us. This morning, the standard that God gives us, first and foremost, is to be in Christ. He gives us the standard to accept Him, to die to ourselves, and to enter the waters of baptism that we might be buried and raised to newness of life. This morning, if you haven't made that judgment call, if you haven't judged that to be the correct action for your life, now is the time to take that into account. Now is the time to put not my judgment aside, to put your judgment aside, and put on God's judgment for what you should be doing from here on. This morning, if we can study with you, pray with you, talk to you about that in any way, if there's anything else that we can help you with this morning, let us know as we stand and we sing.